In my 43 years on the bench, I've presided over thousands of cases: petty theft, drug possession, even manslaughter. I've seen defendants cry, plead, and genuinely express remorse. But I've also seen arrogance, the kind that makes you wonder what went wrong in someone's upbringing. This case, this was different. When I first read the file marked United States versus Mateo Reyes, I didn't know it would become one of the most challenging moments of my career. A 24-year-old man accused of ordering a murder, and when he walked into my courtroom, he laughed. Actually laughed. Let me tell you what happened and why this case has been viewed over 8 million times. Because this wasn't just about justice. It was about teaching a lesson to someone who thought he was above the law. When this case landed on my desk on a cold February morning, I immediately knew it wasn't routine. The charges were severe: conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and witness intimidation. Federal charges, the kind that carries decades behind bars. The defendant, Mateo Reyes, 24 years old, son of Eduardo Reyes, a name I recognized immediately. Eduardo Reyes was a suspected cartel leader who'd been operating between Mexico and the United States for 20 years. The FBI had been building cases against his organization for the better part of a decade. Mateo wasn't just some street-level dealer. He was heir to an empire built on violence and corruption. The victim, Carlos Mendoza, 32 years old, father of 3, who'd been working as a courier for the organization. According to federal prosecutors, Carlos had decided to cooperate with authorities. 2 weeks after meeting with the FBI, he was found shot execution style in a Providence warehouse. The evidence trail led directly to Mateo, who'd allegedly given the order himself. As I reviewed the case file that morning, I felt a weight settle on my shoulders. The evidence was substantial: wiretaps, witness testimony, forensic evidence. But I also knew what I was dealing with. People like Mateo grow up believing they're untouchable, that money, power, and family connections put them above consequences. I've been doing this job long enough to know that the courtroom is where that illusion shatters. I just didn't know how defiant he would be about facing that reality. Let me walk you through what the evidence showed, because understanding this case means understanding the cold calculation behind it. Carlos Mendoza had been working for the Reyes organization for 6 years. He transported money, sometimes drugs, across state lines. According to his widow's testimony and FBI records, Carlos wanted out. He had 3 young daughters, and he'd seen too many friends disappear or end up in prison. When federal agents approached him, he made the hardest decision of his life. He agreed to cooperate. The wiretap evidence was chilling. I listened to hours of recorded conversations as part of my review. On one tape, dated January 15th, I heard Mateo's voice clearly. Carlos thinks he's smart. He thinks the feds will protect him. Nobody leaves. You know what needs to happen. When I heard that, I had to pause the recording. This wasn't some impulsive act of violence. This was premeditated, calculated, a young man casually ordering another man's death like he was ordering dinner. 3 days later, on January 18th, Carlos was found dead. The coroner's report showed 2 gunshot wounds to the back of the head. Professional, efficient, meant to send a message. The investigation moved quickly. The FBI had been monitoring the organization for months. They had phone records placing Mateo in contact with the suspected shooter. They had financial records showing a $50,000 transfer the day before the murder. They had testimony from another organization member who'd been granted immunity, testimony that Mateo had bragged about handling the rat problem. What struck me most as I reviewed everything wasn't just the violence. It was the casualness of it. Mateo was 24 years old. Most young men his age are finishing college, starting careers, falling in love. Mateo was ordering executions. The federal prosecutors had built an airtight case. They had evidence that would have made any defense attorney nervous. But as I would soon learn, Mateo Reyes didn't get nervous. He got cocky. As I continued reviewing the evidence in preparation for the trial and eventual sentencing hearing, the scope of Mateo's involvement became even clearer. The prosecution presented testimony from 7 witnesses, many under federal protection. One testified that Mateo had said, "My father taught me, you show weakness once, you're finished." Carlos made his choice. This wasn't just about eliminating a threat. This was about demonstrating power. The forensic evidence was damning. Ballistics matched the murder weapon to a gun registered to a shell company linked to the Reyes family. Cell tower data placed Mateo's phone within a mile of the warehouse on the night of the murder, despite his claims he was in New York City at the time. But what troubled me most was the witness intimidation charge. While awaiting trial, Mateo had allegedly arranged for flowers to be delivered to Carlos's widow, black roses with a note that read, "Thinking of your family." The FBI intercepted communications showing this was meant as a threat. Carlos's eldest daughter was 8 years old. This monster was threatening children. I'm a father, a grandfather. When I read about those black roses being delivered to a grieving widow and her traumatized children, I felt something I rarely allow in my courtroom. Anger. Real, deep anger. But I couldn't let that cloud my judgment. That's not who I am as a judge. My job is to be fair, to follow the law, to ensure justice is served properly. So I set my personal feelings aside and focused on the facts. The medical examiner's testimony was particularly difficult to hear. He described how Carlos had been forced to his knees before being shot, how he likely knew what was coming in those final moments, how he died terrified and alone in that cold warehouse. At 68 years old, I've presided over murder cases before. But this one, the calculated nature, the young age of the killer, the complete absence of remorse, this one stayed with me even before Mateo ever walked into my courtroom. By the time we reached the sentencing hearing, this case had attracted significant media attention. Federal cases involving cartel activity always do. But this one had extra elements: the youth of the defendant, the brutality of the crime, the wealthy family trying to buy the best defense money could purchase. My clerk informed me that news crews from 3 states were requesting courtroom access. Social media was buzzing with opinions. People were angry, demanding maximum punishment. Some were speculating about whether Mateo's family connections might somehow influence the outcome. I want to be clear about something. I don't pay attention to public pressure. I never have. Whether 8 people are watching or 8 million, my responsibility remains the same: to apply the law fairly and deliver justice without fear or favor. That said, I understood why people were watching. This represented something larger than one murder case. It was about whether someone born into power and privilege would finally face consequences, about whether the system could hold accountable someone who'd spent their entire life being told they were above it. The viral attention didn't change my approach, but I was aware that my courtroom would be packed, that every word would be scrutinized, and that this sentencing would send a message far beyond the defendant standing before me. I spent the weekend before the sentencing hearing in my chambers, reviewing everything one final time. I prayed, as I often do before difficult cases, and I prepared myself for whatever attitude Mateo Reyes would bring into my courtroom. I just didn't expect him to laugh. When Mateo Reyes walked into my courtroom that Monday morning, I watched him carefully. I always do. You can learn a lot about a person in those first moments, how they carry themselves, how they regard the process, whether they understand the gravity of what's happening. Mateo was dressed in an expensive suit, navy blue with a perfectly pressed white shirt. His shoes alone probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His hair was styled immaculately. He looked like he was walking into a business meeting, not a sentencing hearing for murder. But what struck me most was his expression. No fear, no remorse, just a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, like this was all beneath him. The courtroom was packed. Carlos's widow, Elena, sat in the front row with her 3 daughters. Behind them, federal agents who'd worked the case, media representatives in the designated press section, and in the back, I noticed several men in expensive suits, likely Reyes family associates or attorneys monitoring the proceedings. I took my seat at the bench and looked out at everyone assembled. We're here for the sentencing of Mateo Reyes, who has been found guilty by a jury of his peers on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and witness intimidation. Before I impose sentence, I want to hear from both the prosecution and defense, and I'll give Mr. Reyes an opportunity to address the court. The federal prosecutor stood and presented her sentencing recommendation. She was thorough, professional, devastating in her recitation of facts. She requested the maximum sentence under federal guidelines, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Then it was the defense attorney's turn. He argued that Mateo was young, that this was his first conviction, that he deserved a chance at rehabilitation. The arguments were competent but hollow. We all knew what the evidence showed. Finally, I looked directly at Mateo. Mr. Reyes, you have the right to address the court before I impose sentence. Would you like to do so? His attorney whispered something to him. Mateo waved him off dismissively and stood. Judge, he began, and I immediately noticed something. No respect in his tone, no deference, just casual indifference. I think there's been a misunderstanding. The evidence against me is circumstantial at best. I'm a businessman. I've never hurt anyone. I let him speak, though every word was more insulting to Carlos's memory and family. He continued for several minutes, denying responsibility, claiming he was being targeted because of his family name, suggesting that corrupt agents had fabricated evidence. Then, and I'll never forget this moment, he looked directly at me and actually chuckled, a small laugh like he was sharing a private joke. Your Honor, with all due respect, I think when my appeal goes through, we'll see this whole thing was blown way out of proportion. I felt every eye in the courtroom turned to me. The widow gasped quietly. Even Mateo's own attorney looked uncomfortable. I sat back in my chair and took a slow breath. I've been doing this for 43 years. I've been disrespected before, but this level of arrogance in the face of murdering a father of three, this was something else entirely. Mr. Reyes, I said, keeping my voice level. You just laughed. He shrugged. I mean no disrespect, Judge. I just think the sentence recommendations are... You laughed, I repeated, in a courtroom where the widow of the man you murdered is sitting 10 feet away from you with her 3 daughters who will grow up without their father. His smirk faltered slightly, but not enough. I continued, leaning forward. Let me tell you what I see, Mr. Reyes. I see a young man who has never been told no in his entire life, who grew up with enough money and power to believe that consequences are for other people, who ordered the execution of a man trying to do the right thing and then threatened that man's children. The courtroom was absolutely silent now. You think this is blown out of proportion? I asked. Let me share something with you. I've reviewed every piece of evidence in this case, every wiretap recording where you casually discussed murder like you were ordering takeout, every financial record showing how you paid for a man's death, every witness testimony describing your complete lack of humanity. Mateo's expression was hardening now, the smirk gone but replaced with cold defiance. Mr. Reyes, you said you've never hurt anyone. That's interesting, because I listened to you on a recording say, and I quote, Carlos thinks the feds will protect him. Nobody leaves. You know what needs to happen. I paused. 3 days later, Carlos Mendoza was shot twice in the back of the head and left in a warehouse like garbage. I turned to Elena Mendoza. Mrs. Mendoza, would you like to address the court? She stood shakily, tears streaming down her face. What she said next broke everyone's heart in that room, except apparently Mateo's. She talked about how Carlos had been trying to protect their family by cooperating, how their daughters asked about their father every day, how their 8-year-old had nightmares about men in dark suits coming to their house. When she described finding the black roses on her doorstep, the threat Mateo had arranged, her voice cracked completely. Mateo sat motionless, staring at the table in front of him, not even pretending to care. After Elena sat down, I took a long moment before speaking. Mr. Reyes, stand up. He rose slowly, buttoning his suit jacket like he was wrapping up a business meeting. I've been on this bench for 43 years. I've sentenced murderers, thieves, and people who've committed terrible crimes. Some showed remorse, some didn't, but I have rarely, Rarely seen someone show such complete contempt for human life and the justice system as you've shown here today. I paused, letting that sink in. You laughed. You actually laughed when discussing your potential sentence for murdering a father of three. You think your family connections will save you. You think money and power mean the law doesn't apply to you. Another pause. Let me correct that misunderstanding right now. I looked at Mateo Reyes standing before me, and I thought about what I wanted him to understand, not just about this case, but about the life he'd lived and the choices that brought him here. Mr. Reyes, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. He met my eyes with that same defiance, but I could see a flicker of uncertainty now. Good. It was about time reality started breaking through. You come from a world where money solves problems, where violence is a business tool, where human life is expendable if it serves your interests. You've lived 24 years in that world, and you've come to believe that's how everything works. I leaned forward. But this courtroom operates on different principles. Here, truth matters, evidence matters, justice matters, and here a man's life, Carlos Mendoza's life, matters more than your arrogance and your family name. I saw his jaw tighten. The federal sentencing guidelines for your crimes, given the aggravating factors, recommend life imprisonment. Your attorney has asked for leniency based on your age and lack of prior convictions. The prosecution has requested the maximum sentence. I paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. I've thought long and hard about what justice requires in this case, and I keep coming back to one thing. You ordered a man's execution because he wanted to leave your organization and protect his family. You didn't pull the trigger yourself, but you gave the order just as surely as if you had. Mateo's face was reddening now, anger replacing arrogance. This wasn't a moment of passion. This wasn't a terrible mistake made in the heat of anger. This was calculated, premeditated murder, and then you threatened his widow and children with those black roses. You tried to terrorize a family that was already destroyed by your actions. I picked up my notes, though I didn't really need them anymore. I'd made my decision. Mr. Reyes, here is the sentence of this court. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. On the count of conspiracy to commit murder, I sentence you to life imprisonment. On the count of racketeering, I sentence you to 20 years, to run consecutively. On the count of witness intimidation, I sentence you to 10 years, also consecutive. I heard a sharp intake of breath from the defense table. That's life plus 30 years, Mr. Reyes. Under federal guidelines, there is no parole. You will spend the rest of your natural life in federal prison. Now the smirk was completely gone. His face had gone pale. For the first time since entering my courtroom, he looked like he understood. But I want to explain why I've structured the sentence this way, because this isn't just about punishment. This is about making sure you understand what you've done. I looked directly at him. The life sentence is for Carlos Mendoza, for the husband and father you took from this world, for the man who was trying to do the right thing and paid for it with his life. That debt can never be repaid, but you'll spend your life in prison as a consequence. The 20 years consecutive for racketeering is for all the other victims of your organization, for everyone who suffered because of the poison your family spreads, for the communities destroyed by the drugs and violence you profit from. And the 10 years for witness intimidation, that's for Elena and those 3 little girls, for terrorizing a grieving family, for showing such complete moral bankruptcy that you'd threaten children. Mateo was gripping the table now, knuckles white. You laughed earlier, Mr. Reyes, when discussing your potential sentence. You thought this was all a game, a minor inconvenience, something your family's lawyers would eventually fix. I shook my head slowly. Let me be crystal clear. You will never leave federal prison. You will never sit at your father's table again. You will never wear expensive suits or flash money around. You will wake up every day in a cell, and you will think about the choices that brought you there. I paused one more time. I hope, and I genuinely mean this, I hope that somewhere in that cell, over the decades ahead, you find remorse. I hope you eventually understand that Carlos Mendoza's life mattered, that his daughter's pain matters, that you weren't above the law, you were subject to it like everyone else. But whether you find that understanding or not, justice has been served today. Mrs. Mendoza and her daughters can sleep knowing that the man who destroyed their family will never walk free again. I looked at the bailiffs. Take him into custody. As they approached, Mateo finally broke. You can't do this, he shouted. My family will appeal. You don't know who you're dealing with. I remained calm. Mr. Reyes, I know exactly who I'm dealing with, a convicted murderer being held accountable under the law. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down with finality. After I adjourned court and the bailiffs led Mateo away, now handcuffed and finally understanding the reality of his situation, the courtroom slowly emptied. Elena Mendoza approached the bench with her attorney. Her eyes were still wet with tears, but there was something else there now, too. Relief. A sense that maybe, just maybe, some measure of justice had been done for Carlos. Your Honor, she said quietly, thank you. Thank you for seeing who my husband really was, for understanding what this took from us. I stepped down from the bench, something I rarely do, and looked at her directly. Mrs. Mendoza, I'm so deeply sorry for your loss. Carlos was brave. He tried to do the right thing, and he deserved better than what happened. I hope this sentence brings you and your daughters some measure of peace. She nodded, unable to speak, and her attorney guided her out. Later that afternoon, my clerk came into chambers. Judge, the video of the sentencing is going viral. Over 3 million views already. People are calling it one of the most significant cartel-related sentencing hearings in years. I nodded slowly. I don't do this job for recognition or viral videos. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't glad the message was getting out, that justice can prevail, that no one is above the law, that arrogance doesn't protect you from consequences. Several federal agents stopped by my chambers over the next few days to thank me. They told me how much the sentence meant to them, how hard they'd worked to build this case, how gratifying it was to see it result in real accountability. One agent told me something that stuck with me. He said, Judge, we've been chasing the Reyes organization for 15 years. Mateo thought he was untouchable. What you did today, that sends a message to every cartel heir who thinks they're above the law. 6 months later, I received a letter from Elena Mendoza. She wrote that her daughters were in therapy, that they were slowly healing, that knowing Mateo would never hurt anyone else helped them feel safer. She included a photo of Carlos with his girls, all of them smiling at the beach. I kept that photo in my desk drawer, a reminder of why this job matters. If there's one thing I want people to understand from this case, it's this. Justice isn't about vengeance, it's about accountability. It's about ensuring that actions have consequences, regardless of who your family is or how much money you have. Mateo Reyes grew up in a world that taught him he was special, that rules applied to others but not to him, that money and power meant immunity. And for 24 years, that worldview was reinforced at every turn, until it wasn't. In my courtroom, everyone is equal. The day laborer and the cartel heir stand on the same ground before the law, and when someone commits murder, when they order the execution of a father trying to protect his family, they face the full weight of justice. What troubled me most about Mateo wasn't just the crime itself, it was the complete absence of remorse, the laugh when discussing his potential sentence, the arrogance in the face of unimaginable suffering he'd caused. That's what happens when someone is never taught that other people matter, that consequences are real, that life itself is sacred. I've been a judge for 43 years. I've sentenced people I felt sorry for, people who made terrible mistakes in terrible circumstances. But I've never felt sorry for someone like Mateo, someone who had every advantage, every opportunity, and chose cruelty and violence anyway. Carlos Mendoza deserved better. He was trying to do the right thing, trying to protect his family, trying to leave behind a life he knew was wrong. And he was murdered for it by someone who thought human life was disposable. That cannot stand. Not in my courtroom, not in any courtroom where justice matters. My hope is that this case reminds people that the law applies to everyone, that no family name protects you from consequences, that privilege doesn't grant immunity, and that somewhere in this imperfect system there's still room for justice to prevail. Mateo Reyes will spend his life in prison. He'll have decades to think about the choices he made and the man he killed. Whether he ever finds remorse, I don't know. But Elena Mendoza and her daughters will know that the person who destroyed their family can never hurt anyone else again. That's what justice means to me. After 43 years on this bench, through thousands of cases and difficult decisions, that's what I still believe. Everyone deserves accountability. Everyone deserves fairness. And everyone deserves to live without fear of those who think they're above the law. That's the lesson. That's what I hope people take away. And that's why, even at 68 years old, I still show up to this courthouse every day to make sure that justice, real justice, is available to everyone who walks through these doors.